This recording is going to cover the functions and composition of blood. Functions of blood include transport of substances such as nutrients and waste, gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, molecules such as vitamins or lactic acid, enzymes and hormones. Another function of blood is the regulation of pH and osmosis. Blood is a homeostatic fluid, meaning that the body is going to keep its composition within a narrow regulated range. The pH of blood is kept at a narrow 7.35 to 7.45 pH. This makes blood a slightly acidic, a slightly alkaline substance. Ions such as blood sodium, blood potassium, blood chlorine, and blood calcium are also kept within a narrow pH. Other functions of blood include maintenance of body temperature. Because blood is a homeostatic fluid and it is kept within a narrow homeostatic range, the temperature of blood is kept constant at around same as body temperature, 37 degrees centigrade. When the body needs to adjust its temperature, it will use blood to do so by either enlarging blood vessels and bringing more blood and thus more warmth to an area, or constricting blood vessels, cooling the area where the blood vessels are being constricted. Another function of blood is immunity. Immune system cells and immune proteins circulate within blood. The fifth function of blood is clotting. When blood vessels are damaged, blood contains clotting proteins and fibers that will not only clot and stop the bleeding, but it will also allow for the repair of the damaged blood vessel. So you should know the basic functions of blood and what are some of the substances mentioned that are transported in blood. Now, this is going to be a very broad overview of the composition of blood. Blood can be what we call fractionated. What that means is that we can spin blood in a centrifuge, allowing for the different components to separate based on their molecular weight. The lighter component, which would be plasma, will be at the top. The heavier components, which in this case will be cells, will be at the bottom. So blood is essentially divided or fractionated into two components: the light fluid plasma, which represents 55% of blood, and the heavier cells or cell debris, which represents 45% of the blood. So you should know that the liquid matrix represents 55% of blood, while the cells and cell fragments represent 45% of blood. When you look at plasma, notice that most of it, 91% of plasma, is made of water. Proteins make up about 7% of plasma, and other solutes make up about 2% of plasma. Out of the proteins that make plasma, the most abundant is going to be albumin, followed by globulin and fibrinogen. Albumin represents roughly over 40% of the proteins in plasma. Other solutes will be ions, nutrients, waste products, gases, etc. Out of the form elements, notice that there is a white, it's very small white layer right above between plasma and the red blood cells. That layer is called the buffy coat, and it contains platelets and white blood cells. Most of the form elements that make up blood are going to be made of red blood cells, or also called erythrocytes. So you should know that blood can be fractionated. Most of blood will be made of a liquid called plasma, 55%. 45% will make up what are called formed elements, which are made of mostly red blood cells. So again, plasma constitutes 55% of blood. Plasma is a colloid made of 3 types of proteins. Most plasma proteins are made by the liver. That's something important to remember. And because, again, blood is a homeostatic fluid, the composition of plasma remains constant. Out of the 3 types of proteins that make up the 7% of plasma, the most abundant, 58%, is albumin. Albumin is the most abundant of plasma proteins, followed by globulins, which represent 38% of plasma proteins. And the least abundant, 4%, is fibrinogen. Remember, these 3 proteins represent 7% of the composition of plasma. Remember that over 90% of the composition of plasma is going to be water. So albumin is a protein that is made by the liver, and its function is to maintain blood colloid osmotic pressure. What that means is that albumin is going to attract water to itself, keeping water within blood vessels. So albumin prevents the loss of water in blood vessels to the tissues. If albumin is not working, or there isn't enough of it, the water molecules will leave blood vessels, and they will begin to go into the tissues, causing tissue swelling or edema. So the function of these liver protein in blood is to maintain water within blood vessels. Another function of protein, which is almost as an accidental function, is that albumin is a very large protein. Because of its size, oftentimes other components like fatty acids and bilirubin and hormones may attach to it. So that is a second function that sometimes we see in albumin. The third protein, most abundant protein in plasma, are globulins. Globulins can come in 3 types: alpha globulin, beta globulin, and gamma globulin. Alpha and beta globulins are made in the liver, and they are transport molecules. TBG, thyroid binding globulins, are the molecules to which thyroid hormone binds. High and low density lipoproteins, HDL and LDL, are also globulin proteins that in this case bind triglycerides, fats. Complement is an immune protein made by the liver that is also a globulin. Gamma globulins, on the other hand, are immune proteins secreted by immune system cells. So antibodies, for example, are gamma globulins. So notice the difference between complement, which is an immune protein made by the liver, versus gamma globulins, which are immune proteins made by immune system cells. The last component of the proteins of plasma, the least abundant, is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is involved in clotting. It is a fibrous type of protein, And when it is removed from plasma, plasma is then called serum. So the liquid that appears after blood has clotted is serum, not plasma. Now remember that 55% of blood is plasma, is liquid. Out of that 55%, 92% is water, 7% are proteins, and the remainder are other substances. The 45% of blood called formed elements is comprised mostly of cells called red blood cells or erythrocytes, which represent 95% of formed elements in blood. 5% represent white blood cells or leukocytes. And thrombocytes, which is another term for platelets. Leukocytes and thrombocytes are found in the buffy coat, which is the whitish layer that appears between plasma and red blood cells when blood is spun. So you should know what are leukocytes and thrombocytes and where they can be seen when blood is spun. You should know erythrocytes is another term for red blood cells, and they represent 95% of formed elements in blood. Hematopoiesis is the term that describes the blood cell formation which takes place in the red bone marrow. In an adult, red bone marrow is found in the sternum, ribs, body of vertebra, pelvis, proximal epiphysis of humerus, and proximal epiphysis of femur. Hematopoiesis, again, is the formation of blood cells which takes place in red bone marrow. You should know what hematopoiesis means and where it happens. A hemocytoblast is the name of the stem cell from which all other blood cells are made. In this PowerPoint, you can see the stem cell, the hemocytoblast, and from it come the proerythroblast, which give rise to the red blood cell, the erythrocyte, the myeloblast, which will give rise to some of the white blood cells. The lymphoblast will give rise to another type of white blood cell called a lymphocyte. The monoblast gives rise to the monocyte, which is another white blood cell. The megakaryoblast gives rise to the megakaryocyte, whose cytoplasm is broken off, and this is what we call the platelets. So hemocytoblasts differentiate into 4 populations of cells, which gives rise to all the white blood cells, red blood cells, and the cells from which platelets arise. So you should know what are hemocytoblasts and where they can be found. So we have gone over the type of the components of blood. Remember that blood is connective tissue, and we know it's connective tissue because it's made of 2 components, the cells and the matrix. The most abundant of these components are going to be the matrix, which is a fluid matrix in this case. It's called plasma. You should know the 3 components that make up plasma: water, proteins, and other substances. And the most abundant of these 3 components is water. You should know which are the 3 proteins found in blood: albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. You should know the most abundant being albumin. And you should also know the function of albumin and the body organ, the liver in this case, which makes the protein. Now, this question talks about the kidneys filtering blood. And when kidneys filter blood, they remove small molecules. Would you expect to find a significant amount of albumin, which is a large molecule, in urine? Under normal conditions, you shouldn't, because albumin is too large to be filtered out of blood. That having said that, it is normal to find small amounts of albumin in a normal urine sample. Large amounts of albumin in a urine sample is definitely an indication of kidney damage, because kidneys should never allow albumin to be filtered out because it's a large molecule. You should know the types of globulins found in blood and the origins, the organs that make them. So remember, alpha and beta globulins were made by the liver, while gamma globulins were made by immune system cells. Notice this question 8, the two types of plasma proteins that transport thyroid hormones. We had albumin itself transporting thyroid hormones sometimes, but that is not its main job. The thyroid transporting molecules are the ones which are a type of globulins. Alpha and beta globulins are the ones that normally transport thyroid hormones. You should also know the differences between plasma and serum. We have gone over Buffy code, and we've gone over the 3 different types of globulins. So this concludes this first part of chapter 9.